Well, hi everyone. Thanks for coming to our little event here. I've been looking forward to talking with the people that we have on here, the three other folks. Hopefully, I won't do too much talking myself because I talk with myself all the time, so I know what that's like. But this is in the VMware Tanzu's Dev Deep series, which will be fun. And it's a topic that I'm always curious about, having been an application developer myself, and that's figuring out like what the deal is with developers and Kubernetes and on that topic. So I'm Michael Coté. Everyone calls me Coté except for my wife and my mother. So you can call me whatever you like, but Coté would be nice. And as we go through this, if you come up with questions, be sure to put them in the Q&A because we should have 10, 15 minutes, depending on how excited we get about the topic towards the end to go over those things. And it's always nice to know what people are thinking. So with that, I want to invite our panelists onto here, and we'll get each of them to give a kind of an introduction of what they're doing and what their relation to the Kubernetes world and developers are. And to do that, if each of you can tell me a little bit briefly about yourself and kind of what your experience is with developers using Kubernetes and thinking about it, the kind of conversations, the thoughts that you have about it, in a nice introductory thing. And why don't we start with you, Scott?
Awesome. Well, it's great to be here. And my name is Scott Rosenberg. I'm the lead architect in the CTO office at TerraSky, a consultancy systems integrator globally. I'm based in Israel. And I really started my Kubernetes journey about 4 years ago, and came up from the traditional VMware infrastructure world up to cloud management, and then started getting into Kubernetes pretty deeply, and have had the privilege of working on some of the open source on Kubernetes as well as Cluster API itself, and help our customers implement Kubernetes at scale in enterprises across the globe. So great to be here.
Yeah. And how about yourself, Liz?
Hi, yeah, so my name is Liz Rice. I am Chief Open Source Officer at Isovalent, which is the company that originally created the Cilium project, which a lot of people are using in Kubernetes for connectivity and security and observability of that connectivity. I've been pretty involved in the kind of cloud native world for quite a few years now. I used to be the chair of the technical oversight committee at the CNCF. I'm currently sitting on the governing board of the CNCF. So yeah, I've been really, pretty immersed in this whole cloud native and Kubernetes world for the last probably coming up on 6 years now. Seems a long time.
That's right. And anything over 5 gets a little foggy at some point, I find. And how about yourself, Kaslin?
Hello, I'm Kaslin Fields, and I'm a developer advocate at Google Cloud, where I focus on Google Kubernetes Engine and open source Kubernetes. I've also been involved in the Kubernetes world probably around 6-7 years. I started out my journey with Kubernetes at NetApp. So I kind of come from the storage space. I feel like all of us here kind of come from the operations side of things. These days, I'm a co-chair of the Special Interest Group for Contributor Experience in Open Source Kubernetes. So if you are ever interested in contributing to Kubernetes, I hope to see you there, and I hope to be able to support you. Excited to talk about developers in Kubernetes today.
And you mentioned that many of us, well, let's see, most of us, perhaps all, kind of come from an operations-y, like we've been steeping in that for quite some time. And I think that's the first thing I'm always curious to discuss in this area is obviously here we are as we were counting. It could be 6, it could be 7. We've lost track of the time, however many years. But obviously Kubernetes is incredibly, popular. There's plenty of people use it, as we see, at least 2-3 times a year at the CNCF conferences. All of us see that quite a bit. And, I'm curious, like, what you think it is about it that if we kind of narrow it to developers, to application developers, like, what is it about their interaction with it that kind of like makes them so interested in it? Like, what helps drive, how are they helping drive its popularity? Since, it is kind of an operations-y thing, kind of, sort of. or totally. But how about we start with you, Liz? Like, what is how do application developers kind of fit into the Kubernetes world, and how have they been driving it as a community?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this really comes down to, the business requirements. Application developers have jobs to do to ship features and, make their customers successful using their software. And what Kubernetes has done is enable things like shipping software in broken down into different services rather than having one giant monolith, and the ability to upgrade and update those services in real time, or so we don't have to wait for an entire release of a monolith. People can be constantly releasing new features, and Kubernetes taking care of things like scaling those services, scaling those applications. And I think that's really been attractive to businesses, and it allows developers to not have to think about some of those things in quite the same way. They can think about things on a more kind of microservice basis, which has a lot of, I think, architectural benefits. And I also really like the sort of term of thinking of Kubernetes as a distributed operating system. This ability to say, well, we're going to have some primitives that are Kubernetes primitives. And that's what the application developers need to know about, things like pods, but they don't need to worry about things like how is their application going to scale, or how are their different services going to discover each other, because all of that is taken care of by the infrastructure layer.
And then, so Kaslin, how about yourself? What do you? I mean, I'm always intrigued by the idea of this like common layer. I guess we would call it a layer of abstraction, and developers especially like that. They're crazy for it. And what coming from your experience and your background, like what is like how are application developers fitting into all this? Why are they so interested?
Yeah, I'm meeting more and more application developers who are getting involved with Kubernetes. And a lot of them, probably the most common story that I hear is kind of, I like how Liz put it, it's about the business. A lot of them are hearing from their managers, from their organizations, we're going to be using Kubernetes now. We expect you to be able to use it. And a lot of the time, management, when they decide to start using Kubernetes or a specific large platform tool that a lot of groups are going to be using, a lot of the time when they start that process, they may not know exactly how that process is going to work for each individual team. So a lot of the developers that I'm meeting are in a process where they're figuring out, how does Kubernetes work with what I do, and how much responsibility do I have over it? So part of the conversations that I have with those developers often are, well, here's what Kubernetes does. Tell me about what you do. Let's see where the intersection point is. And I'm seeing more and more developers having more and more responsibility over Kubernetes, being kind of expected to wear more and more hats, which I'm always like, I don't want you to have a lot more work, but let's see how we can make that work for you as best we can.
Right. It's the dreaded hat rack situation, like that you don't want
Mhm.
to have to deal with that too much. Yeah. I mean, and that might be an interesting thing to return to, is like the what would you call it? The different forces that are driving interest in this, right? Like everyone loves the drive-by architecture decision from someone else. But you're in a very similar position, Scott, where like you see a lot of different places, right? A lot of different people doing things. And what is kind of like the role and the interest, the kind of interaction that you're seeing application developers have with Kubernetes? How's it fitting into what they're doing?
Yeah. And I think it really changes based off of both which industries people are in, as well as, based off the different geolocations, we're seeing a lot of differences overall of the interest from developers. In general, I will take probably the less accepted or less popular thing, which is that I don't believe that app developers should care about Kubernetes as much as they do, because I think it is an operational concern. and that we need to do, as Kelsey Haytower used to always say, Kubernetes is a great platform for building platforms. And I remember one of my favorite lines was a guy from VMware, Dekel Tanko, he told me once, he said, giving the Kubernetes API to a developer is like taking myself and putting me as the pilot for a 747 full with people. It's about as dangerous. And I would agree with that at a lot of cases. And that's where I think Kubernetes, its outcomes are what developers care about. But they don't care about what a pod is, what a deployment is. Should I be using a vertical pod autoscaler or a horizontal pod autoscaler? Should I be using Knative or should I be using Kida? Or they don't care about that, and that's out of their realm. And I think luckily that's where we're going in the Kubernetes world. Things like Crossplane, things like kubevela, different tools that are coming and building abstractions on top. And I think they want the benefits of Kubernetes. They don't want to deal with Kubernetes. They want something above that. And that's kind of what we're starting to see.
Well, with this, I mean, the three of you have touched on what you're talking about there, Scott, and it kind of, it makes me think of the question of like, so where are you seeing that layer of, you could call it abstraction, that layer of like, I don't want to know what's going below that. like when you have discussions with developers, and then also from the other side, the people who are the platform builders, like, what are you hearing as far as like, all right, this is as far as I want to go? Kind of like, as Liz was saying, like, yeah, I should probably know the concept of a pod, right? Or kind of know how the different units of my applications, how they're going to be living together and interacting, right? But then there's various other layers in there. But like, where are you seeing that level kind of come around, or people's kind of interactions with it? And how about this time, Kaslin, you tell us what you think first.
Yeah, the thing I'm most excited about in this area is very much along the lines of what Scott was saying, the platform engineering trend. I'm really excited about the work that's going on right now in many different organizations, where they're spinning up these platform engineering teams, or there are folks who are kind of picking up that discipline. And what I think that means is enabling self-service. That seems to be at the center of this platform engineering trend. It's teams that enable other teams within organizations to self-serve using whatever tools the organization has to use. So tools like Backstage, I think, are really interesting. That's one tool that I see a lot of people using to kind of create this abstraction layer. And when I talk to those folks who are doing this, I think the coolest part of it is that they're trying to make it work for their organizations. It's not that there's one consistent way that we abstract it necessarily. I think there's a lot of things that can be consistent about it, but making a great developer experience for the different teams that they serve. So making different workflows to serve different users. So a developer workflow with Kubernetes through one of these tools. I don't have specific examples from the field, but I would imagine might be more like, I've created my code, kind of tying more into CI/CD and giving them a little bit more information and control over what kind of hardware, understanding a little bit more about the hardware that's being used to run their applications through these platforms that enable self-service.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. One of the ideas I don't know, ponder or come across or talk with people a lot is kind of, as you're getting to, like, there is as Scott was saying, this kind of like a toolkit nature inherent in it, and there's almost like, so what is the ideal interface for all this? And I'm speaking very broadly, for all this infrastructure-y stuff that we would want to build. Like, what do we want that tool to look like customized in our organization, which historically is not always very possible with whatever kind of infrastructure things you might be using. Well, how about yourself, Scott? Like, you kind of like formed this question in my head as far as like where the layer of developer fun is that developers would be interacting with it. Like, what are you kind of seeing where, like, how far deep does the developer get?
So my approach with this and what we're seeing is, I think everyone wants Heroku up or CF push. The thing is that they want to be in complete control over what happens behind that. And right, I think the other main thing that we're starting to see a lot of trends of are the golden path, where teams are building like very, very, very simple APIs of a hey, now you want to go on the golden path, you can do whatever you want. Is on in production, like everything has been today, right? And you can do click and ticket ops and everything will be great. Or you can have a streamlined approach through our homegrown custom, CF-like experience or Heroku-like experience that we can now build on top of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is not a container orchestrator. It's a magnificent API server that can also run containers amongst 17 million other things that we're only coming up with every single day with new operators and new concepts. So really, I think it's about building that abstraction layer that is that CF Heroku-like experience, things like build packs, things like that, completely hiding away the infrastructure detail, and then letting them, those still peek under the hood, but giving them the ability not to care about that. And then every developer can go as deep as they want. But that's their choice, not a necessity for them.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So yeah, I'm interested to hear your take on all this, Liz, given all the different points that you've been involved in here, and especially, when you kind of have like a kind of board involvement. I'm sure you hear a lot of stuff, right? Like as all of us do, but like, there's you whether you want it or not, there's a lot of different voices that you have to nod along to and think about and listen to. So like I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I was really glad Kaslin mentioned platform engineering, because I think that is the kind of, let's say, movement or the trend towards trying to find where that layer of abstraction sits. And particularly in really large organizations where they've got, thousands of developers, they're trying to find this, as Kaslin says, self-service model. They're trying to make things consistent. They're trying to provide tools so that developers can write their code and ship their code and debug their code and, fix it when it goes wrong, without having to understand all of the complexities and, things like GitOps, things like security tooling, things like, connectivity layers. All of those things are kind of, a PhD topic in their own right. There's so much that people could try to get their heads around, but really, should they? They've got business applications to write. So I think this whole kind of Kubernetes and beyond, and all of the building blocks that you need to sort of put this platform together, incredibly powerful. But if you're coming in, to your, I don't know, banking job, or I don't know, fitness application, or whatever, that has nothing to do with software infrastructure, you want to be able to write user-facing code, and you don't want to be thinking about things like, I don't know, the security controls that are being used as your upgraded pod gets deployed or something. You shouldn't have to think about that. And I think that's why platform engineering has become such a hot topic, because it's pretty broad. There's an awful lot of things you can put inside a platform, and hopefully that's going to make individual application developers' lives a lot easier.
Yeah, and I think there is a good kind of good feel in that phrase, platform engineering, the engineered part, right? We've built up and engineered and kind of, to go all metaphoric, sanded off the edges and made the joints perfect. And I don't really know carpentry, but that sounds like something from that sphere. And so I think now all of that said, of like figuring out where the layer is that developers should be. Like there is, I mean, we've probably all seen this year over year, there's always like this complexity of dealing with Kubernetes. And I don't know. I've been around long enough that I feel like it's the complexity of dealing with every single new technology that comes along. It's just like, yes, it's difficult for some time. But to that end, like for those like developers who are interested in this and kind of like want to start learning about it, like what are you seeing as effective? Like what's a good approach for them or resources for them to look at? Like how would you advise people to start learning and figuring this stuff out? And why don't we start with you, Kaslin?
You know, a suggestion just occurred to me that I don't think I've ever given before, but
Oh, fun.
I think if you're I think if you're a developer in an organization that is telling you you're adopting Kubernetes, go learn it. Um, at this point, of course, you can go through Kubernetes the hard way, classic introduction to how Kubernetes itself works. One piece of advice that I heard from one of my peers recently, who also does not work at Google, but said that the Google Kubernetes engine quick start is a really great way to learn it. But I think the great piece of advice that I would give, hopefully it's great, that I've never given before, is maybe go meet your operations team.
Sure. Yeah.
If you've never met like any Linux sysadmins or folks in kind of generally the operations space who work in your organization, maybe go meet them because they can probably help you really understand how Kubernetes was designed to work, the
Mm,
problems it's designed to solve, and how what you need to do kind of fits in with it. Because that I think is kind of hard to get from just doing a bunch of tutorials on like, here's how you use Kubernetes, here's how
right.
Kubernetes itself works. You really need the context. So maybe go meet some folks who are either in the Kubernetes community. You're welcome to join us on Slack at slack.k8s.io or k8s.slack.io. I think it's the second one. You're welcome to join us in our community and talk to the folks who build Kubernetes about it, but maybe meet the operations folks in your organization.
I approve of your crazy new idea. I think it worked out, and because it's making me think, you know, as you were saying earlier, the other thing that's beneficial is probably as a developer, the way Kubernetes is being used and built in your organization is going, the intention is that there should be some customization, right? And so not only do you, like the way I think about what you're saying is, and I still maybe don't know this for as many things as I would like to. I always want to know how some technology wants me to think. Like you were saying, the
Mm-hmm.
context or the intentions, right? And like not only learning that about, let's say, from the perspective of an organization, a third party, an external technology like Kubernetes, but then you need to know how your operations people want you to think, so to speak, right? Like how they've customized it and think that you're using it. So the you know, you need to establish some, have lunch with them. It's always them somewhere else over there would be seems like it would be helpful. Well, how about yourself, Liz? Like what if people want to get, developers want to get this better understanding, like what are you seeing them be successful with? Or the other option is always like, don't do this. That doesn't work out.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just building on what Kaslin said, you know, there's also tons of community out there, right? There are loads of meetups and, you know, conferences and groups that people can, you know, share thoughts and ideas with. I think, you know, particularly now that we're, you know, able to meet in the real world again, it's, you know, giving us that opportunity to have those conversations with peers who maybe don't work for the same organizations and you know, learning what's working and not working for each other. I think I'd also say there are tons of companies and like resources out there for trying things out. Lots of companies who've got hands-on labs that you can try things out with. You know, I know for myself, if I really want to learn something, I need to get my hands dirty playing with it. I can't just read about it or look at boxes. I have to, you know, feel it for myself. So I would definitely say search out those kind of hands-on labs, do the tutorials. There's some really, really great material out there, you know, in the Kubernetes docs and beyond. So yeah, there's no shortage of cool things to learn from.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something that is well, we all know it's very difficult for any given thing, let alone a technology, to achieve, and that is like a big, almost like self-perpetuating community. and that's like one of the major benefits, is like it is kind of self-powering and out there everywhere, right? There's tons of people who are willing to help out with that. Well, how about yourself, Scott? Like how are you seeing, like when you work, when you work with people who are looking to understand how to use Kubernetes, mostly developers, but other people, like what do you see them doing that works out well?
Yeah, I think for operators, it's for sure Kubernetes the hard way. Otherwise, they're not going to understand what the tool that they just bought, that's a thing, is actually doing under the hood, and they won't know how to debug and are going to have to call enterprise support for every small issue. When it comes to the developers, the one thing they cannot do, in my mind, and it's what I always tell them, do not deploy a kubeadm cluster. Do not go and deploy. If you're going to deploy, do kind or minikube or Docker desktop on your machine. Do the easy click single button of, take the Terraform module of EKS and use the defaults and deploy it, GKE, whatever. Do not get involved in the stuff that doesn't matter to you, right? If you want to learn Kubernetes and you are a developer, you are never going to be dealing with how the kubelet talks to the kube API server and which TLS certificates it needs. So please do not just add that cognitive load onto yourself. You want to spin up locally, Kind or Minikube are amazing solutions that let you spin it up on your desktop with no dependencies almost, and just get started, right? And typically what I say when it comes to getting started, I think like Killer Coda online, which used to be Katacoda, and then now there's Killer Coda. There's Educates, which is an open source platform that lets you create your own Killer Coda type things, self-hosted, are amazing things. And we're starting to see organizations building their own training platforms. But really, if you want to get started, take a pet project of your own that you're interested in and try and make that work on Kubernetes, right? Because the only way you're going to learn is if you're interested in it. If you're told you need to learn Kubernetes, don't necessarily just follow what a guide tells you to do. So you're just learning the raw material. You want to create a blog? Awesome. Learn how to deploy WordPress onto Kubernetes using Helm and understand what you need to know, get things up and running, and do something that gives you value. Otherwise, it's just going to be raw data. Kubernetes is only going to come in 9 months in your company because procurement and all that took some time, and you're going to forget everything that you learned before. So make it relevant.
Well, it sounds like you could put together a good anti-fac. You've had it sounds like they have some extensive experience of like I've told people, please don't do this. That's a good list to have. And I'm also having to deal with this recently. It's also too bad it's not going to solve my procurement problems, because that's always a bizarre mystery to get across. Well, so kind of sticking with the application developer part, like we talked about this a little bit, but I don't know the answers to this, which is why I'm asking it. But like, we kind of alluded to this based on what you're kind of saying, Kaslin, and I think what is kind of like the upward leaky abstraction you see Kubernetes having on application developers, on architectures, right? And I think each of you might have an interesting perspective on this, in that, like I was saying, I used to be an application developer, and I would notice when the infrastructure I was using or the need for it to be on the internet or things like that would kind of like drive the way I did my application, would drive the way I architected it. And I'm always curious with any technology, but especially with Kubernetes, like it's kind of easy to say like, you should do 12-factor apps. Now we're done, right? But I wonder if there's some sort of like constraints or sort of architecture decisions that if it's running on Kubernetes, that you start thinking about as an application developer. And how about Kaslin? We start with you.
This is like the how does Kubernetes make you think question, right?
Exactly. Yeah, make the application developers think, right? Like,
yeah.
Who knows how it makes the operations people think? I think they like whatever happens there, but like the developers.
My go-to thing there that I try to always tell people about when they're learning Kubernetes for the first time, and I think is going to be interestingly relevant for app developers is that Kubernetes makes you think about your compute and your storage separately.
Right. Yeah. No, yeah.
Because yeah, because what Kubernetes is doing is you've got all of these machines, you've got applications you need to run. Kubernetes helps you match the application to a machine to run it on. But at scale, which Kubernetes is really meant for use cases where you're running very large scale, like thousands of copies of your application, hundreds or thousands of nodes of actual machines in the cluster. At that kind of scale, it's rarely the case that your data is in the same place as your application. Usually you have to kind of separate out the data and the part that runs because the data is going to be so large that it doesn't fit on a single machine either, or it needs a specialized machine in order to run on. So that's kind of the weird way that you have to wrap your brain around Kubernetes that I try to warn people about most of the time is you're going to have to think about the part of running your application separately from the part of the data your application needs
Right.
or produces.
Yeah. No, I mean, exactly. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing where, yes, it'd be very easy to not even realize that was a thought to be had, to have like triple deep passive voice on things. But like,
I've seen people trip on it.
Exactly. Well, how about yourself, Liz? I mean, I think,
Yeah.
especially in a place like Isovalent, right? Like I look at the networking stuff there, and I'm like, oh, my head hurts, right? like there's all sorts of stuff going on there, but in the broader Kubernetes world as well.
Yeah, I mean, networking is a sort of world to itself, but ideally, networking becomes kind of transparent so that application developers don't need to think about that. But when I think of Kubernetes, I kind of think about all these reconciliation loops happening. The whole system is built on things checking whether their little world matches the state that it's supposed to match. We have a declarative approach to everything where we say, I want it to be like this, and if it's not like this, try and make it so, at all sorts of different levels in Kubernetes. And I think that means that application developers need to think about things in a much I don't know quite how the right word to say this, kind of almost like a looser way. You can't do a thing and expect that it will always have the result that you wanted it to. You might do a thing
Right.
and then kind of see whether it had the desired effect and keep doing it or come up with something else until it meets what you expected. So I think maybe Kubernetes is helping people to think about things in a kind of how to deal with errors, how to deal with scale, how to deal with delays, that kind of thing that you need in this slightly uncertain world where we will eventually become consistent, but not immediately.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great example because it is like, I don't know what the opposite of leaky and leaky abstraction is. It's intentionally so of like, there's a certain way of doing your applications so that they're more resilient, among other ilient words and illices. And like, you're almost, if you don't do it that way, it will be more difficult in a Kubernetes world. And so you're kind of, in a beneficial way, forced to think about that, which does have lots of implications about how you do your code, just like if you separate your storage out does. Well, how about yourself, Scott? Like, what are some thoughts in this area that are percolating over there?
I would definitely say that the number one is what Liz just mentioned, which the idea of the eventual consistency within Kubernetes kills 99% of people's minds when they first reach Kubernetes. And it's like, well, kubectl create deployment, and it was created. No, it wasn't. Well, technically a record in etcd was, but it may take a bit of time until it actually comes up, and at some point it'll be good. The idea of the eventual consistency is definitely a big thing people have to wrap their minds around. I think the other real important one that we're starting to see more and more in the successful Kubernetes implementations is more event-driven architectures as well, and not going down one of the biggest mistakes that we've seen is companies that said, ooh, microservices, and they created microservices even smaller than a microservice, and they broke it down way too much and their performance got so bad. Or they try and they create what I like to call microliths or monoservices, and they just take a monolith and throw it into a container and think everything's going to work. When you're in Kubernetes, I think you have to think about networking a lot more. And not from the technical details that things like Cilium from Isovalent and whatever take care of the under the hood, but you have to think about network hops. Because when I was running on a single machine, I didn't care. It was another CPU cycle. Wonderful. Everything was great. Everything was fine. It was all inter-process communication on the same machine. In Kubernetes, all of a sudden, we're starting to talk about network between every single microservice we build. And that adds overhead. It adds complexity. It adds security constraints. So what used to be, could have been an afterthought, security and networking, and yeah, we'll deal with that after. We'll lock down the machine. No one can access it. It's fine. Now has to be at the forefront of your architecture. Otherwise, you're in a much worse situation than you were with monoliths, right? So you have to put networking and security up front because that is now critical. That's how your application internally communicates as well.
So, I mean, you bring up well, all of you bring up good points, but you know what you're directly making me think is, you know, there's a form of this question that's like, well, when is it not good? Which is always fun. But I think the way I like to think about that question, kind of based on what each of you is saying, and especially you, Scott, is, so if you're evaluating applications that you have, and you know, we all want the great outcomes of, you know, more agility and more security and all the illities. Definitely, that's great. And like, but the next step below that is like, all right, so I am either making new applications or I have existing ones that I still want to survive. and so like, if I, like, what's the kind of criteria that I should look through to think about this would be a good thing to start off on Kubernetes or to migrate to Kubernetes? Like what are especially easy ones on one end, and then what are especially like maybe do that after the holiday break, like ones. How about yourself, Liz? We could start with you.
Yeah, so I think really, you know, what we're talking about here is trading off kind of complexity against things like the ability to scale and the ability to be resilient.
Right.
And, you know, so if the cost of that resilience and scale is a ton more complexity, well, do you need the resilience and scale? And the example of, you know, figuring out how to get your WordPress blog onto Kubernetes, really good learning exercise, but I don't think my blog needs 5 nines.
Right. Yeah.
So I think a lot of it is to do with, you know, what is this application? How variable is the demand for this application? Is it something that, you know, can you actually save a ton of resources by being able to scale it up and down, you know, maybe over the 24 hours of a day, or you know, maybe it's seasonal, and that ability to be able to respond to, you know, resource or use your resource, adjust your resource requirements according to demand, could have huge economic impact. Wouldn't affect my blog, but you know, that kind of what are the things that are important to your business? Are your cloud costs significant? And if they are, maybe that is something that could be addressed using Kubernetes. Yeah, complexity versus scale.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of like, well, the first step is, do you need it?
Yeah.
Right? Like, is there a compelling reason, like something that's driving you towards that? Well, how about yourself, Kaslin? Like, what like what are those kind of filters on the easy end and the hard end of like how you would start picking the applications you want to spend your next few months with?
I think Liz put it really well. Like, if you don't need the complexity and the resilience that Kubernetes is offering you, then maybe don't use it. I think generally problems within the Kubernetes space, if you follow them down to their roots far enough, you're going to end up either at the kernel or in the network. And if you
that's my job. Yeah.
If you don't want to care about things at that level, maybe think about why you're using Kubernetes in the first place.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I like I was saying earlier, networking always makes my head hurt, and I always think like maybe we should spend the next 10 years really fixing that up. That would be great. Like I don't know if that means we need some RFCs or I don't even know how that's done, but like we should address that. That would be cool. So anytime someone works on that, it's always very beneficial to sort it out. Because really, I also too just want to make sure my WordPress install is working, and that's an annoyance to deal with. How about yourself, Scott? Like when you, to use another phrase for it, when you've kind of been involved in or looked at like portfolio analysis of like the types of applications you would want to apply Kubernetes to, or does it go the other way? You would want to apply to Kubernetes. Like what's the criteria, the analysis that runs through your head?
So I definitely, anytime I have the conversation with someone, it's the first question is why Kubernetes? And then if there isn't a good answer, then I tell them, so don't, because it adds complexity, but it's amazing, right? I think overall for people getting started with Kubernetes, please do not start with persistent applications and things that have persistent data. Start with stateless applications. Stateful applications work great in Kubernetes. We've made huge paths forwards in Kubernetes over the last few years, but it adds so much complexity to it, especially when you're in the clouds with multi zones and start dealing with zonal storage, and it just adds too much complexity. Start with stateless apps that are simple. That's where you're going to have the best time. Number two is please do not be like one of the customers that I had that the first app they decided to bring up was WebLogic with a DB2 database into Kubernetes. No, bring more like modern microservice typical architectures into Kubernetes, something that's lightweight. Graal VM, if you're using Java, use Go, use applications that are small and simple. That's where Kubernetes does its best. That's where a container can be small. It can scale quickly. You want to think about the best, smallest, stateless applications by far. Mm-hmm. From there, you can start going down all the other paths. Kubernetes can run batch processing. Kubernetes can run AI, ML workloads. It can run a lot of persistent workloads. But don't start there, right? Add that in when you want it to be next to your other workloads that are already there and you already have the proficiency in the baseline of Kubernetes.
Mm. Yeah, you know, you're hitting on something I see in all get better at computers in large organizations things, which is try to do something simple for a while, so you can figure out what you're doing, right? Like, because there's always this pressure to say like, I don't know, in 12 months we're going to have an amazing return on investment. Just look at this chart. And it's kind of like, that seems scary. Like, why don't we have like a more pragmatic, just less impressive chart so we know what we're doing instead of like getting a little overly ambitious. Well, one of the questions from the audience is essentially like, and this is another area where I don't really know what I'm talking about, but I know the words. So this will be fun. Like, there's WebAssembly or WASM, I think they say out there. And so someone was asking, like, is this something that is going to replace Kubernetes? Like, how does it fit into that? And why don't we start with you, Kaslin? First of all, what is WebAssembly? You can help me out here.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this because I actually just went to WASMCon in Bellevue. So that was like a couple of weeks ago. So this is fresh on my mind. And I've been teaching lots of people about what WebAssembly is and why it's exciting. So WebAssembly is another approach to virtualization. It's more kind of in the container realm than it is in the Kubernetes realm. This is my understanding. I'm sure Liz will correct me. Liz is probably deeper in this space than I am. But so WebAssembly, one analogy that I've liked for how it works is kind of like the JVM. I learned Java in school. A lot of us are familiar with Java, and Java works by having this virtual machine that understands Java instead of like machine bytecode. And then it translates that into machine bytecode. So then it's kind of abstracting away the underlying hardware. WASM is kind of similar. It's a level of virtualization where it's abstracting away that underlying hardware. So it gives you a lot of flexibility with the kinds of hardware that you're running your applications on. And it also gives you a lot of flexibility with the kinds of languages that you're developing in it on. That was one of the initial concepts of WASM. The interesting thing about WASM to me is that it's kind of split. It's kind of managed to work across different worlds that I normally wouldn't put together. It started off as a browser thing. It's called WebAssembly. So it was like,
Right.
let's avoid writing JavaScript by putting a different layer in between so you can use different languages like Go or something to write your web applications. But then somehow that ended up getting translated into the kernel. So it became like a container level of abstraction as well. So the way that works with Kubernetes is you can run WASM containers. I heard the term WASM containers at WASMCon, which I was excited about, on Kubernetes. And that works by using the container primitives from containerd, actually. So it uses some consistent standards of containerization, and then it has its own shim over top. If anyone is familiar with the Docker shim kerfluffle, it's another one of those cases where you can install the shim within Kubernetes, and then you can run these containers, these WASM containers within Kubernetes instead of a different OCI compliant container like straight up containerd Docker containers. You can run WASM containers instead.
Okay.
Does that
Okay.
help?
No. That makes sense. I well, one, it'll be good to hear like your thoughts on how it fits in with Kubernetes, is, to the point of the question, is this like a replacement or something? But two, you're making me realize that like, I feel like a lot of the innovation in development in the last 20 years is people trying to run away from JavaScript. And yet here we are. It's always persistent. But yes, so like, no pun intended with persistence, but like what do you see? How does WASM kind of like intertwine with like the direction that Kubernetes is going? Are they best friends or just acquaintances? What's happening there?
I think WASM is growing in popularity, and there are 3 use cases that I heard at WASMCon that I think are really exciting and actively gaining momentum really fast. And those are Edge, because WASM provides that kind of extra hardware abstraction for your application. So your Kubernetes cluster has a bunch of machines that may have different architectures, different configurations, and WASM can help kind of abstract away a little bit of that for the application level. So WASM is really interesting in cases where you're running like Kubernetes Edge clusters on interesting hardware. Like you've got a bunch of Raspberry Pis or something. So it's very interesting in those situations for hardware reasons. It's very interesting in AI applications because it's kind of a more efficient approach to the virtualization even than containers. So using resources even more efficiently plus that hardware abstraction makes it very interesting for AI use cases, especially at the edge. And then app packaging and distribution, of course, because of the same reasons again.
It seems, as always, once again, Kubernetes and containers are going to help make a lot of fried chicken. It comes up over and over again. How about yourself, Liz? How do you see? I mean, you have your perspective from all your various roles in there. Like, how is WASM kind of like intertwining with over there at the CNCF and also in your own experience?
So Kaslin has demonstrated she already knows way more than I do about WASM. So I think my kind of understanding of it is, it's more like containerization. It's an alternative to the container part rather than an alternative to Kubernetes. And then you start hearing things like, do you want to orchestrate those WASM containers? Workloads is probably a better word.
I like the word.
With Kubernetes, I know, I've heard people using Nomad for scheduling and orchestrating WASM. So I think there's, probably some interesting building blocks that can be composed. At the end of the day, I think it is all cloud native because it's all about ways of making this software that's portable to different environments, that can be scaled, that can be kind of controlled with these similar ideas of resilience and scale in mind. The other use case I've come across, and it might be a little bit niche, but is in networking for things like the Envoy proxy, where they have the ability to run sort of specific little networking features as WASM plugins within the proxy, which itself is almost, this isn't the right word, but you could almost consider that proxy as a plugin into the networking layer. So
Right.
it's kind of the fractalizing the network interface. We can have all these little tiny bespoke network functions.
Yeah. I mean, I have no idea what I'm talking about here, but from what you two are saying, it seems like there's an application where I'm going to be highly metaphoric here. If you want like a highly specialized little tiny unit of compute, then like that you don't really need to worry about like orchestrating at a gigantic scale and coordinating with anything. It's like a nice way of packaging up. Here's like, like as you're saying, a plugin or a proxy or whatever for networking or running on an edge device. It's just like, well, this is pretty good for that kind of scenario. Which, all right, I'll have to go dig around on that some more. But how about yourself, Scott? Like, what are you seeing, or maybe as Liz was saying earlier, getting your hands dirty with when it comes to WASM and Kubernetes and things like that?
Yeah. So I've done some rudimentary playing around with WASM, but really haven't completely grokked it in my head yet and completely understood it. I think the industry is still trying to understand exactly what its use case is. But I think the number one answer in my mind to the question is no, it will not replace Kubernetes. And the reason is technologies never replace another technology. We still have mainframes. We still have old CPU architectures. The question is, are they prevalent or are they just in their niches, right? We still have mainframes and we still will for decades. We still are going to have bare metal servers, even though virtualization came around decades ago. We're still going to have VMs in 10 years, even though Kubernetes will have been around for decades. And same thing goes with WASM and everything in the future, right? So it's not going to replace it. Will it possibly take away some container workloads from the OCI container style? Maybe. I think the most interesting use case that I've seen for it is KubeWarden, and actually a tool within Kubernetes that does policy management. And I think it's like a plugin mechanism is where I'm seeing a lot of interest in WASM right now, because it can allow bring your own plugin to my platform, like bring an admission controller to Kubernetes that can run now within the Kubernetes control plane instead of as a webhook that's running externally, whatever, without breaking the security of the control plane itself, of the API server. It allows me to run code securely. I think of it almost like the eBPF of the application layer instead of the kernel layer. It's a way of how do I make sure to bundle up something in a secure way that I can now inject into the engine that I want it to run in, whether that's the user space with an application in WASM or the kernel with eBPF, and let you run your own custom logic there. And that's where WASM is coming in with Kubernetes, I think. We're going to start to see more and more of the operators in Kubernetes having WASM extensibility.
All right. Well, I think maybe even if apologetically you brought the phrase up, Liz, maybe plugin. It's great for plugins, right? Like among other things, but like that's I have a fondness for the plugin phrase. I don't know if people say that anymore, but anyhow, well, before we wrap up here at the end, I mean, I think having three people like yourself, it's always a good question to have. Like, what do you see? I don't know. Let's say over the next year or two, the future is a long, distant place where we all shall hopefully live. But like over the next couple of years, like, what do you see? Not only where Kubernetes is going, but as Liz brought up earlier, the kind of community around it, like how do you kind of, and we can do it in the optimistic, here's the hope that we have, but like, what do you think is going to be happening? Like, what can we kind of look forward to? And why don't we start with you, Liz?
I'm really glad Scott mentioned eBPF, because I mean, for me, that's the direction of travel for a lot of the infrastructure that we need in cloud native in general. So, we're already seeing a ton of really good, useful tooling in not just networking, but also observability, security, logging, tracing, you name it, anything that you want to be common across lots of different applications. eBPF is an incredible, powerful platform for that. So that's kind of, I see that, most people won't be writing their own eBPF code, but they will be using eBPF-based tools that will give them really high performance infrastructure to kind of complement or sort of sit underneath Kubernetes, if you like.
Yeah, and hopefully accomplishing one of my minor dreams, fixing networking. Like that,
Yeah.
that would.
Yeah.
How about yourself, Kaslin? What do you think? What do you dream about when you allow yourself to dream about the future of the Kubernetes community?
Having contributors, mainly because I'm the co-chair of SIG Contribex. So having contributors that are having a good time.
Very pragmatic dream.
Yeah. In a more user-centric sense, I think the name of the game always has been and will continue to be abstraction, especially with the focus on AI that's going on right now. I think there is a lot of potential in the AI tools that folks are all excited about right now in terms of the ways that they can help folks learn things more quickly and accomplish tasks more quickly by getting answers to questions kind of more directly. But the things right now are designed to emulate a response, not to give an exactly correct response. So
Right.
with a grain of salt. But the point of that is abstraction. And I think we see that in the Kubernetes world with there's kind of this spectrum between Kubernetes and serverless. So Kubernetes is an abstraction layer above all of these machines that you're running your applications across. Serverless takes that to a different level of just give us your application and we'll worry about everything else underneath without you having to worry about it. I think there's a lot of stuff in the middle there that folks are still exploring and playing around with. We've been saying for a long time that Kubernetes needs to get easier for developers to use. And so we've been talking about platform engineering and ways that we kind of abstract Kubernetes itself away from the end users and make those workflows a lot easier. I think there's going to be a lot of iteration on that over the next several years.
Yeah. The user experience, going from a stick shift to automatic transmission, always very nice. How about yourself, Scott? What are your dreams for the Kubernetes community?
I would like to say, more chaos engineering and service mesh, but we've been saying that for years and have been proven wrong every single year that this is going to be the year of those tools. So if I'm trying to be actually realistic and not hopeful, I think the reality is that I don't expect much from Kubernetes itself, and that's a good thing. I think Kubernetes, those that have been dealing with Kubernetes for a few years knew that when we had 4 releases a year, every single release had breaking changes that affected 99% of customers. Now the breaking changes are much smaller. Ever since about 122, 123, we're much more stable, maybe 124 with service counts, but everything has become much more stable. The platform is getting much more mature, Kubernetes itself. So I think that Kubernetes as a core is a very mature product. I think it's going to be all the ecosystem on top. It's going to be using Kubernetes as a global control plane, right? This idea of building a control plane that Crossplane have been pushing very hard and others are implementing as well. And this idea of let's use it as a great API server for everything and build abstractions and new APIs through the system. That's where I think Kubernetes is going to be leading more. And that's going to be really the ecosystem, because we really do have a solid base now. And now it's for the community to come and build all this ecosystem on top of a very stable, very strong base. And I think the focus is going to be almost maintenance in core Kubernetes in terms of, yes, updating it, keep making small fixes, changing, but I don't think we're going to see anything major in core Kubernetes. And that's a good thing. That's not we're at a stalemate. That's a great thing, because that means that now we can safely build things on top without them breaking every 3 months.
Yeah, you want.
But there's still a lot of exciting work there, and you should become a contributor.
Absolutely. Well, you want stabilization with an increase of the opportunity for helpfulness on top, right? And I think I always have to remind myself, just as an example, that CNCF means Cloud Native Computing Foundation, not Kubernetes Computing Foundation, right? Like, and it kind of gets to that idea of the broader community on top of things. Well, this has been great. Like, it's been a pleasure talking about this stuff, and you know, it's always nice to learn something new. And kind of be able to discuss things with folks like yourself. So first of all, thanks for being on here, panelist. It was really nice to be able to discuss things with you, and thanks for the questions that came in. I know we didn't answer all of them, but they were fun to see as well. And it looks like there's even some questioners who have answered other questions. I guess they become answerers or something. Anyhow. You know, another thing I wanted to mention, since there were a lot of questions and we discussed a lot about like learning and figuring it out, we at VMware Tanzu, we have put together also Kube.Academy. That's right. .Academy is a top level domain name, which is very thrilling. But there's a lot of, as in many other places, there's lots of free courses and things you can check in with there, which are interesting. And you know, hopefully you've enjoyed seeing this, and you know, maybe we'll get around to answering some questions afterwards, if for people who have seen this recording instead of seeing it live. And also, you know, I should mention, since I work at VMware, if you want to see the other things that we work on this space, if you go to tanzu.vmware.com, you can check those things out. And thanks again for participating in this. It was fun. Bye-bye, everyone.